Hello and welcome to today's video on question 3 of paper 2. Now I'm actually going to suggest that you do this question probably as your first reading question. So you do question 5 first of the writing question. You'll see why when you get to that video, and then you would do question 3 next. If you don't want to do the writing question first, okay, but this should be the first reading question you do. Why? Well, look up there, you only have to read source A in order to answer it, and you only have to read, you read the whole of source A, but then you only have to write about 10 lines in that source. In other words, it gets you really focused in on the question really quickly. You get to understand the whole of source A really well, which makes the other questions much easier, and you start earning big marks quite quickly, because there are 12 marks of the 40 available for this one question. Right, let's go into a little bit more depth. You now need to refer to only source A from lines something to something, and that will usually be 10 lines long. About how does the writer use language to persuade or describe? Now remember, this is a viewpoint paper, and so the answer will involve you saying how the description helps give us the writer's viewpoint, or how do the persuasive techniques help give you the writer's viewpoint. I think that you're much more likely to get a persuade question than a describe question, but they're very similar in how you should approach them. Let's check it out. Okay, well, you will almost definitely be asked about only the modern text as source A. So the examples that we've had so far have made that the case, and that is the easier text. It will have language in it that you understand more easily than the 19th century language. So this is another good reason to do the question first, because it's actually easier. It will always be a question about language techniques, and you know that means you must quote. You will already be familiar with the language techniques from a mnemonic, which I'm sure your teacher has taught you. So for descriptions, you'll have something like SOAP aims. For persuasive writing, you'll probably have De Forest. I teach my students Mad Father's Crotch. Search my channel for videos on that. It's much more advanced than De Forest because it has many more techniques in it. Right, what is SOAP aims? Well, they're quite easy. Simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, personification, adjectives, imagery, metaphor, and simile. This is actually a bit of a cheat one, because everything else is imagery, okay? So in this question, if you get the describe question, you are asking how the writer uses these methods to persuade the reader. Okay, so the writer uses this description to make the reader think or feel this or that. Persuade means think or feel. Okay, let's look at Mad Father's Crotch. I won't go through this in loads of detail, but you need to train yourself to do it from memory. So it goes like this: metaphor, alliteration, direct address, facts, anecdote, triplets, hyperbole, emotive language, rhetorical question, statistics, creating an enemy, repetition, opinion, contrasting pairs, and humour. So I haven't looked at that for ages. My students can do that much quicker than I can because they rehearse it. Why is that important? Because these are all techniques that you need to be able to spot to answer this paper, but also techniques that you need to use to do question 5. So if you learn these 15 things, how to use them and what they are, you can get 100% on this paper. So learn the damn things and recognize them, comment on them, and practice using them in your writing. It will make you a brilliant writer. Okay, well, how did students lose marks on this paper? Well, they didn't comment on the effect that the choice of language might have. So they spotted a technique, but didn't say how this was persuasive, how this gave the writer's viewpoint. And if you don't do that, you can't get marks. Or they spotted something, so they might quote a simile, for example, but they didn't name it. You do have to name the techniques once you find them. Another way was students use language features they did not understand. So I love this. Lots of teachers want their students to do well, me included, and they give their students loads and loads of vocabulary. But if you don't understand what that vocabulary is, you just sound like an idiot. And so the examiner's report names some specific things: zoomorphism or zoomorphism. As you can tell, I don't teach that one. Monosyllabic, sydetic listing, syndetic listing even. As you can tell by my confusion, I don't teach that one either. And anaphora, well, actually I do teach that one because it comes up all the time. And if you want to find out what it means, go and watch my Charge of the Light Brigade video, because Tennyson uses anaphora all the way through it. However, if we go back to the Mad Father's Crotch, you will see anaphora isn't in there. I instead use triplets as repetition, and repetition down here. And triplets is by far the most common way actually to use anaphora, so you don't need to know what it means. But if you do, if you're confident, then use the language you have. But the examiners are really upset with students being taught stuff they don't fully understand and then using it wrongly. Okay, only 31% got level 3 or 4. Now remember, the mark scheme is really bizarre, and so although you're graded 1 to 9, the levels in the exam paper just go 1 to 4. Okay, so only 31% got level 3 or 4. In other words, 69% of students, 69 got less than half. You know, that's really hard to find out. It means that there are so many marks to pick up on this question, and that students chuck it away because either they don't recognise the techniques or they don't refer the techniques to how this gives us the writer's viewpoint. So you really, really got to practice that. And the best responses to question 3 were not necessarily responses to the most obvious similes. So this is the 2017 paper, and as you can see, that one did concentrate on descriptive techniques, but the examiners want you to look for stuff that's not obvious to everybody else. Right, well, let's find out what successful students did. Well, they zoomed in on individual words and phrases, and you will have seen that in all my videos. Don't quote paragraphs or long sentences. Zoom in on individual words or groups of words and phrases. They didn't choose the obvious similes, as you've seen. This is a clue that spotting metaphors and personification is seen as a higher skill, and also it's a higher skill in writing also. So if you've got my revision guide, for example, when I wrote my guide to this paper, I had to write lots of answers that were persuasive, so I wrote lots of question 5s, and I found out that actually metaphors are far more useful than similes. I didn't realise that till I wrote the guide and started writing proper persuasive stuff. So that's another bit of examiner's advice. Don't just write about the similes. Look for metaphors. There will always be metaphors, by the way. Guaranteed 100% that writers will always use metaphors. Sometimes they will use personification as well. But you absolutely know that metaphors and similes will both come up if it's a describe question or if it's a persuade question. So that's why I put this bit in bold. This will be a clue that there will always be similes and metaphors in the extract, and so you're always going to write about those, yeah? Always refer that to the effect on the reader, because that gives us the writer's viewpoint. And when you're talking about the effect on the reader, that really means 2 things. It means, how does the writer make you think or feel? That's all it means. So you don't have to use the word effect if you don't want to. You can just say, this makes the reader think blah blah blah, or this makes us feel blah blah blah, and that is the effect. So good luck. Right, well, let's see how that would work with a text. So here's my sample couple of paragraphs, and when we're talking about the effect on the reader, remember we're asking, how would that make us think, or how would it make us feel, either about the character or the narrator. So, as I left my daughter at the childminder's, she gazed up at me with trusting eyes. They watched me back away and flooded with tears, as though a dam had burst, and with it my heart burst too. I fled, my heart radiating grief, and my eyes not daring to look back. So I said earlier that you will definitely get similes and metaphors. Let's have a look at how that works. She gazed up at me with trusting eyes. There's not a simile or metaphor there. Now I've got a choice. I could jump straight in and start talking about the emotive language. So gazed is much more powerful a verb than looked, because it implies that she's spending a long time watching me before I abandon her, and that's a juxtaposition, isn't it? That she's watching me, hoping that she won't be abandoned, and that's juxtaposed with the narrator backing away and moving off. Or we could look at the use of the emotive adjective trusting eyes, and contrast that again with the fact that she's going to be abandoned by her father. Okay, but I'm not going to focus on that now, because I've asked you to look for the similes and metaphors. They watched me back away and flooded with tears. So here, eyes don't really flood. So we could argue that that is a metaphor. It's describing the eyes as like rivers, and that emphasizes just how much sorrow the child is feeling. Okay, well, that's not too bad, but it is an obvious one. As though a dam had burst. So now we've got another simile. It's using as to make a comparison. Why has the writer described it as a burst dam? Well, you've got this idea of all these pent-up feelings being built up over time, but held back like a dam would hold them back, and then suddenly these emotions are expressed, and then you've got this very active verb. You could even call it an onomatopoeic verb, burst. That's the sound of it breaking open, and it shows the power of her sorrow. And then we've got, with it, my heart burst too. That again is a metaphor. Hearts don't literally burst unless, of course, you're having a heart attack, but then it still doesn't burst. So it's likening the heart to something that can be inflated and popped. Another metaphor here, and the repetition of burst emphasizes how closely the father is connected to the daughter, because she is also bursting, and also that he is feeling a similar pain to she is, even though he's causing it himself. And so this is the kind of analysis which is more uncommon. You're not going for the most obvious simile. I fled, my heart radiating grief. There's another metaphor, isn't it? The heart isn't actually a radiator. We could zoom in on the word radiating to suggest not just how this grief is moving outwards, so it's suffusing through his whole mind, but also the fact that it's making him hot and uncomfortable. So he's got a physical reaction to the grief that he's caused. So hopefully you can see what I mean there by zooming in on particular words, talking about the effect, which is always about how the reader thinks about a character or feels about a character. And then a final point, because we could argue this is an autobiographical piece, the narrator wants us to feel the grief of the child, but also the narrator's own grief as a father, and perhaps an element of the father's helplessness. My eyes not daring to look back, again, is personification, because eyes don't have emotions. These eyes are refusing to dare, and you could argue therefore that the father feels that he's been cowardly in leaving his daughter at childminders. So that is it. That is how to zoom in, how to write about the feelings and thoughts that the reader has, and how to get 100%. Hope you found that useful. Do not forget to subscribe. Goodbye.